Yeti Airlines is a Nepalese airline that operates domestic flights within the mountainous nation of Nepal. Now, if you're a longtime viewer of my content, you're probably aware that this channel's history with Yeti Airlines stretches back quite some time, as one of the first videos I uploaded to this channel a couple of years back detailed the infamous 2008 Yeti Airlines Flight 103 crash at the world's most dangerous airport, the Tenzing Hillary Airport in the rural village of Lukla, Nepal, which would ultimately claim the lives of 16 people. In wake of this crash, Yeti Airlines' reputation within the industry would take a significant hit, especially after the official inquiry into the incident found that Yeti itself and the culture within the company's operations had significantly contributed to the accident's occurrence. With its reputation now in tatters, Yeti would form a subsidiary airline to continue to charter flights to the most rural airports across Nepal, as these routes are frequently booked by foreign mountaineers and trekkers, and provided Yeti with a major source of income over the years. This new subsidiary airline, named Terra Air, was in large part created to avoid the stigma of the Yeti brand following the Yeti Flight 103 crash in 2008, and Terra Air would indeed largely live up to the established legacy of its parent company, as Terra Air has also been featured in another one of my previous videos on the channel, which detailed the final flight of Terra Air Flight 193 and the simply baffling decision-making of the flight crew that ultimately resulted in the deaths of all 23 people aboard the flight back in February of 2016. While Terra Air was created to obfuscate Yeti's continuation of their rural routes to continue to appeal to their tourist customer base, after Yeti's name had been tarnished following the aforementioned Flight 103 collision, as I briefly mentioned at the end of my Flight 103 video, Yeti Airlines would not cease to exist in its entirety, and would in fact continue to charter flights along a number of routes across Nepal. With Terra Air assuming their rural flight routes, Yeti would primarily charter flights between Nepal's capital city, Kathmandu, and other more developed metropolitan areas in Nepal. These routes primarily appeal to domestic Nepalese passengers, and thus Yeti wouldn't also rebrand these flights to Terra Air, as they wagered that the Flight 103 crash and the wave of backlash in its wake would not have as nearly as significant of an impact on domestic travelers, at least not to the point that it would outweigh the previously established brand recognition of Yeti Airlines within Nepal, and thus necessitate a name change. Their predictions would in fact hold significant merit and would turn out to be generally true, as over the course of the following decade, Yeti would flourish and would become one of the largest domestic airlines within Nepal. However, this newfound success aside, most of Yeti Airlines' operational practices would remain largely the same, despite a number of crashes mostly involving their subsidiary airline, Terra Air, over the course of these years, including the aforementioned Terra Air Flight 193 collision. Thus, it was only a matter of time until these practices within Yeti Airlines operations would again result in yet another deadly collision, although this time, the collision would result in the deadliest air crash in Nepal in over 30 years. On the sunny morning of January 15th, 2023, 68 passengers at the Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, Nepal, would embark aboard an ATR 72-500 turboprop airplane registered 9N ANC for a brief, approximately 25-minute flight to their destination of the Pokhara International Airport in the city of Pokhara for Yeti Airlines Flight 691. These 68 passengers consisted of 36 men, 22 women, 3 children as well as 3 infants, with 49 of the passengers hailing from Nepal, 5 from India, 4 from Russia, 2 from South Korea, 1 from Argentina, 1 from Australia, 1 from France, and 1 from the United Kingdom. The passengers were accompanied on the flight by 4 crew members, bringing the number of souls on board the aircraft to a total of 72 people. The cockpit crew on this flight would stray a bit from the typical cockpit hierarchy of a captain who is first in command and a first officer who is second in command, as this flight would notably sport 2 captains instead. The captain assuming the left-hand side captain's seat and assuming primary control of the aircraft, as the pilot flying was a 44-year-old woman named Anju Katiwada, who had logged a total of 6,396 career flight hours and a total of 186 flight hours operating ATR-type aircrafts. The captain seated in the right-hand first officer's seat in the cockpit, assuming the role of pilot monitoring for the flight, was a 58-year-old man named Kamal KC, who had logged a total of 29,901 flight hours over the span of his career, with a total of 3,300 hours spent operating ATR-type aircrafts. While Kamal was in fact the far more experienced pilot of the pair, he was aboard the aircraft as an ATR instructor pilot to oversee Anju, with the day's flight serving as her test before she was officially granted an ATR certificate to become captain for future flights. Rounding out the crew members aboard the aircraft for the flight were 2 cabin hostesses, a woman named Ocean Ale Magar, who notably had a decently large online following on TikTok and posted a short clip of herself aboard the plane just before the passengers would embark, as well as a woman named Surjana Hongthun. Notably, the crew aboard the aircraft had already completed 2 previous flights earlier that morning along the same route, as their first flight of the day had followed the exact same route they would intend to follow, with service from Kathmandu to Pokhara, followed by a return flight from Pokhara to Kathmandu, where they would pick up this group of passengers for another flight to Pokhara and back. At approximately 10:30 a.m., the cockpit crew would receive clearance from air traffic controllers to proceed for takeoff, and the ATR 72-500 would achieve liftoff from the airport's runway at 10:33 a.m. that morning. The weather conditions that day were clear and sunny, with a reported 6 to 7 kilometer visibility range, with wind speeds ranging from 3 to 5 knots and an outside air temperature of 14 degrees Celsius. After the aircraft had reached its desired cruising altitude, the 2 pilots would begin to chat and debate the best method to land the plane at the newly constructed Pokhara Airport's runways, as the approach to the airport's runways was notably difficult, particularly runway 12, which required a sharp turn to align the aircraft correctly during the final approach, and in fact, inspectors had noted the dangers of potential terrain hazards and the sharp turn needed to approach runway 12 during the airport's construction. The cockpit crew's lively discussion would continue throughout the duration of the flight. However, they were briefly interrupted by 2 ground proximity warning system alerts in the latter half of the flight, which is a common occurrence for flights in the region and has led to a general desensitization to the alerts amongst local pilots, a phenomenon which I delved into much deeper in my video about Yeti Airlines Flight 193, if you're curious as to why this is the case. And these 2 alerts were ignored, as they did little other than interrupt the duo's conversation during the flight. Upon making contact with the air traffic control tower at Pokhara International Airport, they were assigned to runway 30 for landing, which notably sports a much easier landing approach than runway 12. However, the cockpit crew would request to land on runway 12 instead, as they landed on runway 30 and had departed from runway 12 during their first round trip, and after making this request, they were granted clearance from Pokhara Tower to do so. This decision, presumably, had been made so Anju, the pilot flying, could gain additional experience while under the watch of an instructor pilot. However, the cockpit crew would in fact never actually mention any reasoning for doing this outright, even amongst themselves. At 10:51 a.m. and 36 seconds, they would begin their final approach from 15 miles away from the airport and aligned the aircraft along the landing track for runway 12. At 10:56 a.m. and 27 seconds, the pilot flying would disengage the autopilot at an altitude of 721 feet and would subsequently call for flaps 30 at 10:56 and 32 seconds, with the pilot monitoring replying flaps 30 and continue descent in response. However, despite his affirmation, the flight data recorder would indicate that at this time, the flaps had not been moved at all. However, it was indicated that the propeller rotation speed was reduced to sub 25% and the torque rapidly decreased to 0% not long after. This is because instead of setting the flaps to 30 degrees, the pilot flying had instead mistakenly feathered the plane's propellers, which is a feature of turboprop planes where the pitch of the propellers is turned outwards and parallel with the oncoming airflow in order to reduce drag and adverse yaw, primarily in the event of an engine's failure during flight. Just a few seconds after the pilot monitoring's affirmation, at 10:56 a.m. and 36 seconds, the aircraft's master caution chime would sound, and the cockpit crew would begin running through their before-landing checklist after reducing the power level angle from 44% to 41%. However, while running through the checklist, they failed to identify that the flaps were not set to 30 degrees before they began to bank into a left-hand turn for the final approach. At 10:56 a.m. and 50 seconds, they reached an altitude of 500 feet, and a loud click was also heard in the background following the altitude call-out. At this point, the aircraft's engines were in in-flight idle mode in order to prevent over-torquing. As the plane would begin to bank to the left at 30 degrees as planned, 4 seconds after beginning the turn, the yaw damper would disconnect, which prompted the pilot flying to ask the pilot monitoring whether to continue making the turn and whether she should continue the descent, to which the pilot monitoring replied that she should continue the turn and that she should continue the descent and that she should apply a bit of power if she felt that it was necessary. At 10:56 a.m. and 54 seconds, another loud click rang out in the cockpit, followed by the flaps moving to the 30 degrees position. At 10:57 a.m. and 7 seconds, air traffic control would give final clearance for landing. However, air traffic controllers would not receive any response from the cockpit crew, as the pilot flying had at this point realized that there was no power coming from the engines, which she called out twice to the pilot monitoring, and at 10:57 a.m. and 11 seconds, the power levers were advanced to 62% and increased to full power over the following 2 seconds. At 10:57 a.m. and 16 seconds, another click would sound in the cockpit, and 1 second later, the plane was at an altitude of 368 feet as it banked into its final left turn. 2 seconds after the click sounded, control of the aircraft was handed over to the pilot monitoring, and at 10:57 a.m. and 20 seconds, Anju would again state that there was no power coming from the engines. At 10:57 a.m. and 24 seconds, the aircraft had reached an altitude of 311 feet when the stick shaker was activated to warn the crew that the angle of attack was increased to its threshold. At 10:57 a.m. and 26 seconds, a second stick shaker warning was activated as the plane began a hard left bank. 2 seconds later, at 10:57 a.m. and 28 seconds, the altitude alert for 200 feet sounded in the cockpit, and the stick shaker warning was deactivated as the plane began to plummet from the sky, and it would subsequently make impact with the ground below at 10:57 a.m. and 32 seconds, killing all 72 people on board as the resulting wreckage burst into flames. Astonishingly, the final moments of Yeti Airlines Flight 691 were captured on camera by a local on the ground, and their video showed the plane as it began its hard bank to the left moments before impact. However, even more astoundingly, the final moments of the flight were also captured on a live stream from one of the flight's passengers, a man named Sonu Jaiswal. Before I show you the footage, I will note that while this footage does not contain any graphic imagery, it is rather intense and also features some fast flashing lights, so if you prefer not to see it or are photosensitive to flashing lights, go ahead and skip to the timestamp shown on screen or the next timestamp in the video. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, which miraculously avoided damaging any nearby homes or infrastructure, search and rescue teams were immediately deployed to the scene to search for potential survivors. However, upon their arrival, it became immediately apparent that none had survived the impact. This is because the plane had made impact with the ground at the edge of a deep gorge of the Seti Gandaki River, with some of the wreckage coming to rest along its edges, with the majority of the burning fuselage plummeting into the gorge before coming to rest on the banks of the river below. After the fire had been extinguished, a large majority of the fuselage had been almost completely destroyed by the fire. Subsequently, an investigation into the causes behind the accident was launched by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission of Nepal, and the salvage of relevant wreckage, such as the propellers and cockpit instruments, as well as the recovery of the plane's in-flight data and voice recorders, were undertaken and completed successfully over the course of the following days. The Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission's inquest into the incident would find that the primary cause of the accident was human error, as the in-flight data recorder and voice recorder would both indicate that the pilots had made several fatal errors during their fateful final approach. An autopsy of both bodies would show that neither was under the influence of any drugs or alcohol at the time of the crash, and their work records showed that they had both had ample time to rest between shifts and had not flown an excessive amount over the course of the preceding 7 days, as Anju Katiwada had logged a total of 8 hours and 50 minutes of flight time during this span, and Kamal KC had logged a total of 19 hours and 50 minutes of flight time during this time span. The official accident report would note that Anju had likely mistakenly adjusted the condition levers instead of the adjacent flap lever, with the adjustment of the condition levers resulting in the feathering of the propellers. They would further note that the crew's failure to notice this error had come as a result of poor crew resource management practices, and would further note that the crew may have been distracted by their previous discussion over the course of the flight while they were running through the before landing checklist, where they again had failed to realize the pilot flying's error. The major contributing factors listed by the inquest's final report included that the crew were stressed and under high workload due to operating flights into the new 2-week-old Pokhara International Airport, the proximity of terrain on approach of runway 12 requiring a tight circuit, and the crew's choice to switch landing runways despite this, and lack of appropriate technical skill-based training of the pilot flying, and ineffective crew resource management practices and cockpit discipline. The inquest's final accident report would also suggest several changes to Yeti Airlines' operational procedures in wake of the accident to prevent a similar accident from occurring in the future, including more appropriate skill-based training for crew operating to and from a new airport, and disciplinary corrective actions for crew resource management procedure infractions. The latter suggestion closely echoed many similar recommendations that have been suggested following several Yeti Airlines crashes in the past, including the 2006 Yeti Airlines crash that occurred after a failed aborted landing, which would result in the death of 9 people, including Anju Katiwada's late husband, a man named Deepak Pokhrel. Thank you all for watching.